Last week, we talked with Belinda Bauman and Rebecca Davis. We gained insight into what empathetic listening is and how it assists in the healing process. We also learned that sharing stories gives access into understanding and vulnerability. Join us for part 2 of that conversation today.
And, that almost leads us right into another question we wanted to talk about is this idea that some of these situations are so hard. They're so difficult. But when one person tells their trauma story, it does begin sometimes that healing for that survivor. It empowers others to start their own healing journey. And so I'm going to touch base with you first, Belinda, and then we'll switch it over here to Rebecca. But what does the power of storytelling do for survivors? You mentioned it a little bit with that empathetic listening, but what does it do for survivors in their trauma stories to tell that story?
So in the hypothalamus, when someone is communicating a story of trauma, particularly sexual trauma, there have been some studies that will suggest that up to 14% of that portion of the brain will shrink, as evidenced from brain scans before and after healthy brain versus post-trauma brain, particularly sexual trauma. Just in lay terms, that means that emotional trauma or emotional violence, as well as physical violence, take an actual physical toll on our bodies. If the brain is shrinking and people are becoming unable to communicate, our communication centers can go offline. Our decision-making centers are hampered, if not actually shut down. And so you find people that have experienced trauma or that have experienced gender-based violence making some terrible decisions about the way they want to live their lives moving forward, replaying and reliving, reenacting the scenarios that they have experienced. That biology, right? That science, if we want to call it that, actually has an amazing moment of hope that we can speak into it. As an individual tells their story, either consistently revealing it over time, as with a therapist, a lay counselor, or a trusted friend, or if they give their story repeatedly and let it evolve, let it become no longer disassociated, but let it grow into the actual rooted story in a time and space that was in the past. As we listen to those stories, as we bear witness, and that person sees that we are listening to them through our body, through our face, through the way we feed back to them, through non-judgment, through quietness, the brain can actually regenerate itself. The cells that were lost at the trauma can actually begin to grow back. And if there was ever an example for me of a miracle, that would be it. The actual healing of the body that is done when we listen to one another.
That is so powerful. How about you, Rebecca?
Well, again, in opposition to that, if we think about what happens when a person tells their story, their trauma story, and is not believed, is blamed and shamed and rejected over and over again without fail, I have heard what the people did to me who were supposed to help me, but instead shamed and blamed me and rejected me. What they did was worse than the original trauma. So telling the story is powerful when there is the compassionate witness to receive it, to hear it. And I say receive, that's such an important word there. I receive your story. I see you. I hear you. I validate you. I care about you. And for me, hearing a lot of stories, just recently I had to apologize to someone because I think I sort of boxed her story up a little bit too much, like put it away and wanted to think it wasn't as bad as it was. Certainly not intentionally, but she felt invalidated. And I felt terrible that I had done that to her. And I could tell it was because I was having the secondary trauma issue of being overwhelmed. But it is so important for that compassionate witness, and rejection of the story, the shaming and blaming, is worse for these people, they have told me, than the original trauma.
It's interesting because it, again, kind of goes on what you were saying, Belinda. If we have this brain shrinkage from the original event, and then we add to a compounded trauma of not being believed, not having that compassionate witness, then I'm going to kind of piggyback into this next question is, so what is the lasting impact of both of those? Because, for example, we've had some pretty high-profile cases, for example, the Larry Nassar case, where stories were not believed. There were not compassionate witnesses. And so that abuse just continued to move on. But now we're starting to see that maybe some of these stories are being believed. So I guess I want to say is, first of all, maybe to you, Rebecca, what do these opportunities do for our community? Not just for the individual, but what does it do for our community at large?
Telling the stories?
Yes.
Rachel Denhollander, who is the one who exposed Larry Nassar, had to tell her story again and again in the face of disbelief, rejection, shaming and blaming. Her church rejected her, and it was terrible, but she persevered. She had a supportive husband and some other supportive people in her life. When she was talking to me about it, at one point she said, if it hadn't been for this supportive person and that supportive person and the other supportive person, I couldn't have done this. It was so important to have those supportive people because there were many, many people who mocked her and said she was just out for money. It was terrible. It was terrible. But she and the other women in the Nassar case did help to blaze a trail in that way. And telling their stories in the courtroom, that was incredibly powerful.
Yes.
Incredibly powerful.
How about you, Belinda?
Yeah, honestly, I was a gymnast for 13 years as I was growing up. And I think we all have some memory growing up as young girls of that first time we were catcalled or the first time that something that objectified us hit us. For me, it was this sense of vulnerability that I had with some of the individuals around me as I was doing gymnastics. And so, Rebecca, you'll get this. The amount of PTSD that came for me as I was watching the court cases was very interesting. Even though I wasn't necessarily a survivor from that kind of experience, I was relating to something in my own past. The way Rachel was telling her story was calling out to me to bear witness from something deeper in my soul than just my cocked head and saying, that's interesting. It was calling out to me to actually feel and engage the weight of what was being said. That causes me to think, gosh, was that just me because I had almost a similar experience? Or is this something a little deeper in us as human beings, particularly as Christians, people of faith, that we can, as Christ said, rejoice with those who rejoice and mourn with those who mourn?
Yeah.
Do we have a bigger capacity in some way to take in the mourning, take in the grief, to bear witness at a different level? And if so, then we also have to remember, to those that have been given much, much is required. So we should be engaging our ability to bear witness, to listen to stories of trauma, maybe more than we do, at a higher level than we do.
That's an excellent point.
It's hard, though, isn't it?
It is hard. It is. Because
that's why some people choose not to.
Exactly. Just as a brief side thought, there was a really interesting study that came out from Penn State University in April, at the end of April. And basically the premise of the whole study was, why are people avoiding connecting emotionally with others, why will they not engage the true essence of empathy, of this kind of listening that Rebecca and I are talking about? And, I would love to say that there was a deeply complex reason why people weren't engaging it, but here was the reason. Empathy is a lot of work. That was the result.
True said. That's for sure.
Empathy is a lot of work, and sometimes it hurts.
That's right.
But we're strong. And so I will say again, if we have been given a mandate from the founder of our faith to mourn with those that mourn, what does that mean?
That's excellent.
So what's the essential piece of information we really need to understand about telling and hearing trauma stories, Rebecca?
I think one very important part of listening well, is the humility that says, I don't have all the answers. And I may be hearing something that I'm not familiar with. I may think I'm familiar with everything, but I may be still going into unfamiliar territory, and I need to be ready for that. And in the Christian faith, we say we are ready for it because we are in Christ, and it is a faith-strengthening experience. But humility is so important.
What about you, Belinda? What would you say is one key piece of information we need to understand this topic?
So much of our communication today, our conversations, look like ping pong matches. We serve up an opening statement, and then the other person kind of analyzes the trajectory of the ball coming at them and tries to hit a zinger back. And I think because we've grown into this Twitter space, right, our ability to patiently hold space and listen carefully to others' stories, particularly stories that unfold, that may take time. We like to leave those to the professionals. I actually think that listening as a complex multi-level skill is also something that we are born with. We learn to listen to our mother's voice from the womb, and we can get better at it. I really do believe that empathy and empathetic listening is not a personality trait or a character bent or a magical gift. I really believe that as we embrace our role as listeners and Christians, as people of faith, no matter what faith we come from, that we can grow in our capacity, that we can grow in our skills. So if we find ourselves limited now, I don't think we should give up. I think that it's important for us to continue to pursue holding space with people that suffer.
One of my prayers early on was, God, please increase my capacity, because I knew that I was being too overwhelmed too often.
Those are excellent prayers.
I have a question that's not in the scripts.
Go for it.
Can I go for it?
Yeah, absolutely.
A number of years ago, I was at, I've forgotten the name of the conference. It's the Major Conference on International Development, and I sat in on a workshop. It was led by a professor at Columbia University whose name I have forgotten. I believe this was 2007, so it's been a while. And this man had done a monitoring and evaluation project in one of the Central African countries. It might have been the DRC, working with people who had been child soldiers. And the project that he and his team from Columbia were evaluating was something that provided therapeutic assistance to people who had been child soldiers. And so what he did to evaluate the success of the project was to create a list of quality of life elements. Do you regularly attend church or mosque? Do you have a job? Do you have a family? Do you have a consistent place to live? Do you have a partner? I mean, they're just, basic things like, do you have a good life or not? He said that in every case, without exception, the people who had not been through the program ranked higher in quality of life than those who had. And then he looked at all of us who were paid international development people, and he said, and I quote, what these people needed was to go home, let the locals deal with them, and then get on with their lives. They didn't need us to come in and hold their hand and sing Kumbaya. Now, what I want to talk about is, when does empathy go wrong? Belinda.
Yes, sir.
Is that okay? Is it okay to ask that question? I mean, if we don't want to go there, that's fine. Okay.
Absolutely. Yes.
Go for it.
The answer? Okay.
Yeah.
You know what? If you give me 1 second, I want to wax articulate, and I've got my manuscript where I address this pulled up. And if you give me 1 second, I can do that. Is that okay? Do I have the time?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Hold on.
Do you have any thoughts on that while we're waiting on Belinda?
If a person doesn't move forward and process the trauma, then yes, the person's going to stay stuck. If the person is kept in a place of continuing to need help instead of processing the trauma and working on life skills, then yeah, it's going to be a problem. Empathy can end up being enabling. But it sounded like, from what Belinda was saying, that the African people had a really good system for listening well, that listening well is still very important, and helping a person process their trauma, and then going back into the environment. And there are other aspects of recovery besides listening. And it doesn't have to be just counseling. It can be hard work, hard physical labor can help with recovery, and a number of things, but probably Belinda will have more to say about it than I do.
Well, you do touch on a little bit, and I know we're gonna get into this dark side of empathy in just a minute, but we do talk about what is the difference between being a victim and being victimized, and part of that is a mindset.
Well, a victim is a person who was victimized. That's the definition of victim. But if a person is going to stay in that identity, I am a victim, in the present tense all my life instead of I'm a survivor now, then that can be problematic, yes.
Mm-hmm. That's where I was kind of wondering if that's where you were maybe thinking of that person. Belinda, have you been able to find your thoughts?
I was all prepped for the other ones, and I can't find it right now, but I have been swirling around in this. I'm getting ready to write an article with Dr. Jamie Ayton from the Humanitarian Disaster Institute at Wheaton that is called Killing Empathy. And here's the premise. Some people say that empathy is destructive because it only considers the individual story. And that when we are making policy decisions, when we are gathering data, much like what the conference that you were at was talking about, the cumulative numbers of what they considered successful, we run the risk of not having a full understanding of narrative. Narrative is not numbers, and numbers are not narrative. You need to have both of them in sync with one another to be able to create good policy, good best practices moving forward, especially in places like war zones. I do think that anytime a trauma is localized, that there is a commonality between people's stories in a geographical region, or amongst an age group, or amongst a circumstance, something like a humanitarian disaster. I think that the commonalities drive our ability to touch that thing that we're suffering with inside of ourselves for the sake of another person comes much more effectively and much easier. In that case, then absolutely, the women that I work with in the Democratic Republic of the Congo or in Syria, bearing witness to each other's stories brings a great deal of healing, except in one case. When the people that are in the circle that have either experienced a similar event or are from a similar area present themselves as unsafe, what does that look like? If a woman is sitting in a story circle and she is narrating her story, And she perceives that someone in the circle may take this information and not use it for her benefit, but use it to hurt her in some way, then the story can result in that double trauma that we were talking about. Very similar to not being listened to at all, or even being doubted. So in this case, not only do people have to, if they go back to their regions and spend time being listened to there or being affirmed by their people in their area, they do have to present themselves as being safe. So I wonder if the key is less about the people that are listening to them are from their area and more about we're in this boat together. That makes you safe. That's a thought.
I appreciate that thought. And I think, that kind of dovetails a little bit. We're not going to touch too much into this, but this idea, I know, Rebecca, you've also talked about this. If you don't have a compassionate witness, it's not safe. And I kind of hear Belinda talking about that same thing. We have a stigma, especially in our country, about reporting, about coming forward, because we have not had that compassionate witness, and that does block that healing. I agree with you. I think that there are a need for empathy from that community. But one of the things I've seen, especially on our social media community and Twitter, is that sometimes that can be a common thread that can give an opportunity, but then it also is a place for a story circle not to be safe. So I wonder, how do we get that stigma from reporting our story? How can we move past that stigma? What do you think, Rebecca?
The stigma in the church world about reporting stories is things like you're going to harm a good man's reputation, or gossiping is a sin, or really part of it was your fault and all sins are equal. It's just a lot of different things that are used that sound like they might be biblical truth. They aren't, but they sound that way. But it is designed, in my opinion, to be a circle the wagons effect, to protect the ones who are already powerful and to ostracize the ones who are weak and harmed. So to break the stigma, there has to be this willingness, again, humility, willingness to break open that circle and say, we will do whatever it takes to be the hands and feet and the body of Christ to those around us, especially the oppressed, the ones who are weak and helpless.
That's a good word. That's a good word. How about you, Belinda? Do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I really like what Rebecca said, and I wonder if, just by extension, to say the circling of the wagons could also be called systemic sin. And I think if we are to look at the systems of silencing that our churches, our Christian institutions, universities, organizations use in a systemic way to not only silence women from telling their story, but silence those that might want to bear witness to someone telling their story. See something, say something. That it's in the system to protect reputation, to protect circumstance, to protect history. None of those are actual narratives of individuals. If truth happens at a story level, all of the gospel is nothing but one big story. In fact, all of Scripture is nothing but one big narration, the dream of God. Truth is in the narrative. We must listen carefully to the narrative. If we circled the wagons or created a systemic power grid that people have to navigate in order to find truth, we are less likely to stand with women who experience violence or to stand up for women who experience violence. We miss both our ability to bear witness, but also our ability to advocate.
That's excellent.
Since there are these systems that create an environment in which it is possible for trauma to grow and flourish, what would it look like to prevent trauma? How can we help people who might be perpetrators stop before they get too far? How can we help people know in advance how to either prevent the situation from happening or to deal with it very early on in ways that don't just continue on and on harming them and harming others? What do we do to stop it from the beginning?
Well, I think pornography plays a huge part in the violence executed against women and children. Pornography is a huge industry in this country, the U.S., and I believe in other countries too. And it needs to be taken more seriously. And also, there are people living double lives, and they're living very effective double lives. They are pastors of churches at the same time that they're sex trafficking their daughters, for example. So Christians need to be willing to acknowledge that this is the case and expose them, because these are the wicked that David talks about in the Psalms.
That's you speaking what is true, Rebecca. I'm so grateful for the strong way that you say this. I believe that we're in a Kairos moment, a window of opportunity with the beginning of the Me Too movement, Church Too, She Survives, Silence is Not Spiritual, all of the call for women to give voice to what their story is. And as we do that, we begin to hear the threads of truth. Bearing witness to their stories is a fundamental key to systems changing. I think sometimes we have a theology problem, and I go very carefully into this as a person of faith. If we do not consider this statement, violence against her is violence against us, true, I think we miss the entire point. When Jesus said, love one another as I have loved you, if you ask me, that usurps the simple on-ramp of the golden rule, which is love others as they want to be loved. Now, I think everybody's capable of doing that. I don't think that's our aspiration. Our aspiration is to actually love others the way Jesus loved them. And the way he loved them is to believe that what you do unto this little one, you do it to me. Mm-hmm. And then he goes further and he says, and that little one is me. So we could actually say violence against her is violence against God. I think if we clear up that theology from the pulpit regularly and speak about abuse regularly, if we demonstrate to our church membership the leadership that it takes to equate ourselves with others, if we educate our pastors, our elders, our congregations on what abuse looks like, what it sounds like, what it tastes like, what are the effects from the pulpit, I think that the systematic nature of what we are experiencing in the church, like what is experienced in conflict zones in Congo, in Syria, will also be mitigated. It's the sensitization of the community in a conflict zone that makes all the difference for women experiencing the violence. How much so for the church?
Yes, so true.
Yeah, that is absolutely powerful. I have put in our notes here that Frederick Douglass said it is easier to build strong children than repair broken men. Mm-hmm. And as an educator, I very much appreciate this idea of systems, understanding root causes. I hear several things that you both have shared between pornography and theological misguidedness that might need to be addressed. Because it, honestly, Belinda, if you, and I believe this to be true as well, because I'm not always a great lister, I have not been a very good question writer, as we have learned over the course of this podcast. I've had to grow in that. So if this is a message of hope, and that's what we really wanted today, that yes, there are hard stories and trauma is hard, but there is an underlying message of hope. Anne Graham Lotz says this all the time. When things are falling apart, they are falling into place. So if things are falling apart right now, there's a possibility of things falling into place. And I appreciate this idea that, yes, this is a hard hard subject and we are listening to hard stories. But can we train and educate and learn to be more empathetic in our listening? Can we lean in these conversations? And what I'm hearing both of you say is that yes, that is absolutely possible.
Yes.
I have more hope for us in this current moment than I have ever before in my life. It is when the light is shining that we see. And when we see, we tend to make good choices. That's what I hope for our body as the church, for our role as human beings, that this cultural moment right now, today, tomorrow, the next day, that is ours to steward, not our children's to steward, not the history books to steward. It is ours to steward right now, that we have the capacity to rise because the light is shining. And thank God for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, hope is one of the themes that I blog about a good bit. And also shining the light. I blog about that this is so important.
Well, with that in mind, let's ask our signature question here, which is, what's a metaphor to help us understand this subject? Rebecca?
Well, I was talking the other day with a friend of mine from Armenia. She is actually Canadian, but her heritage is Armenian, and she visited her home country recently. Armenia experienced the second greatest genocide in modern history, and she was talking to me about how, because of all the trauma her people had suffered for so many years, it was as if they couldn't breathe. And then they started taking shallow breaths. And now she's hoping and praying that with a greater understanding of their national religion, which is Christianity, and understanding Jesus Christ, they will be able to take deep breaths. And that was reminding me of what trauma is like. It's like breathing stops, and then people realize, oh, I'm barely breathing. I'm breathing in such a shallow way. But then as they heal, they can take deep breaths. And as they tell their stories, as their stories are received, and as they experience the processing of their trauma, they can start breathing again.
Oh, that is absolutely beautiful.
Fantastic. Yeah. Okay, Belinda.
I come from a Jewish background. My grandfather escaped the Holocaust, and his inheritance to me was a rich history in Jewish stories. So if you don't mind, I think that it's very much like the rabbi who used to sit on his porch with his son. They would watch the people in the neighborhood go past the porch as they sat and took in the evening cool air. And as people would go past, they would kind of shyly look up and see the rabbi sitting there, and they would make their way up to the porch a little sheepishly. And as they came, they would tell their story of their day, or they would tell their story of their suffering, or they would talk about what's bothering them, or what's irritating them, or maybe about the news of the day. And then the rabbi would bless them, and they would go home. Now, his son was a diamond merchant in training. And so one day his son looked at him and said, Dad, you can't possibly look at every person that comes up that walk as somebody you really got to give that much attention to, right? When you listen to their story, it's almost like, they're telling you about Moses or Abraham or some great patriarch from the past. They really can't be that important, right? Well, the rabbi looked at his son and he said, Son, do you have any diamonds with you? And his son kind of looked sheepish and he said, Yeah, I've got a bag that I practice with. And so his son opened the bag and there were 5 diamonds laying out there. His son looked at his father and the rabbi picked up the biggest, shiniest, most spectacular diamond of them all. And he said, Son, this must be the most valuable of all the diamonds that are in this bag. And the son got very quiet and he said, Dad, that's not the way it works. There's a lot of things that go into knowing whether or not a diamond is valuable. The rabbi said, Are you kidding? It's big, it's beautiful, it's shiny. How can it possibly not be the most valuable? And he said, Dad, you really have to kind of study diamonds to be able to pick out whether something's valuable or not. And the rabbi looked at his son and he said, so it is with souls, my son. So it is with souls. For me, the value of somebody's story isn't ours for the decision, for the judging. Everyone's story is valuable, but we have to learn to listen so that we can mine the diamonds that they need and that we need so that we can move forward as people of faith and as the human community.
That is amazing. We have listened to quite the wealth of words, opportunities, the ability to lean in and breathe and take each story as a value. And when we share our stories of healing, we can look at pain through a lens of connection to humanity. And we learn that while we may have experiences that are different, we may not all have the same trauma story, we do not have to stay in those places. And sharing those stories helps bring that place of hope and healing. And I appreciate what Belinda said earlier also, is that truth is in the narrative, and that we have the opportunity to bring that truth to light by listening and showing compassion through that listening to stories. So thank you so much, Belinda Bauman and Rebecca Davis, for being part of our story today.
Thank you for having me.
Join us next week as we talk about local stories and local economies with Jill Hendricks, the owner of Fiction Addiction in Greenville, South Carolina, and Susan Boyer, the author of several Southern mystery novels. As always, we thank you for joining the conversations here at the Afterword. Ask you to, if you've enjoyed what you've heard, to leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And remember that you are welcome to every conversation that happens at our table. See you next week.